All right, we're on week one, and this is lesson one. And I want to cover a few things with Antigone to get you started on it and so you know what we're doing with the play. But even before we do that, I want to cover a couple little issues to make sure this semester goes as best as it possibly can for you. And they're really just things that I've seen students do over the years that have led to them doing a lot better and doing all right. And let me just walk through some of them. Number one, in order to be successful here in English 101 and really to be in any long online class, make sure you check in frequently. Okay, come into Blackboard, take a look over the announcements, also take a look at the calendar. Most of the time when students get confused, they've missed things in the announcements or they've missed things in the calendar, or quite honestly, they just haven't checked in for 2 weeks. And that's a good way to get in a bad position. Students who consistently check in, they know what's going on with the class, they know what's due and when it's due, and everything just goes a lot better. So make sure you keep checking in to follow the announcements and really keep up to date on the calendar. But also make certain where the real work is getting the reading assignments done and the writing assignments, especially at the discussion area. Those are areas where you can easily fall behind. And that's something that's hard to deal with. If you fall behind, it can be really challenging to catch back up, because I know you guys are taking other classes and you've got obligations at home, maybe at work and other places. Make sure you keep up to date on the readings, following the calendar, make sure you're getting the readings done, but also make sure you're getting the discussions done on time. Please keep in mind, if you're confused about something, that's okay. Many of these readings are quite difficult. And also with the discussions, please understand you don't need to get it right the first time. This discussion area really does stand for class. And in a lot of ways, you're experimenting with ideas, sharing them, trying them out. It doesn't have to be right in the discussion area. You just need to give it a good faith effort throughout, okay? So those are the two biggies, but also when it comes to the essays, I really will want to encourage you to follow the draft process. And one thing I mentioned before, and I'm going to mention again, I'm not going to require that everybody follow the early draft stages that I'll be posting. I'm not going to require it. I'm really going to grade you on the final essay. And if you don't do the early draft stages, I won't mark you down. But I urge you to follow the draft process. I really would not be going through it if I haven't seen a lot of students do a lot better just by following the process. It will seem to be kind of tedious, but boy, it does lead to a far better essay in the end. It just breaks it down into a process that you can follow and accomplish certain things one at a time before you move on to other more challenging tasks. It just makes sure you build a foundation as you go through the writing process, okay? So those are the things I'm going to mention at this time. Keep checking in, follow that calendar, make sure you keep on the readings and the writings, and coming up once I start going through the essay, go through that process. I really encourage you to. I've seen real success with students on that. Now, let me give you a little background with Antigone. Most students I find are a little bit familiar with what they refer to as ancient Greece or classical Greece. I'm going to make a bit of a distinction, okay? And really, these are broad distinctions. And really, if you know your history, you can break this down into much finer details, but this gives you the overall view of what led up to Sophocles putting Antigone together. Now, to take a step back, what I'm going to call ancient Greece, okay, is a time period most folks don't know much about. It's really a time when Egypt, Crete, Mycenae, even Troy you've heard of, and Hattusa, that's the Hittite culture, existed in Anatolia, or what we'd call Asia Minor, or really Turkey today. Most folks have heard of Egypt, but Egypt existed throughout this Bronze Age that came before, from 3200 to 1200. And then Crete was a thriving civilization. So were the Mycenaeans, Minoans and Mycenaeans. And in Troy, there was actually a civilization. People know something about it from the Trojan War of Homer. But they've actually found there really was a city there. It wasn't quite as impressive as the one that's described in the poem, but hey, there was one right at the location I'm going to show you. And then Hitatsu, where the Hittites lived. These were very large civilizations. There's very little writing. Most of the Egyptian writing is in hieroglyphs. Some of it is accounts of a battle of Kadesh, but not much writing. Lots of trading was going on and a lot of fighting, but they were getting along. It's kind of like a big family. They're fighting and trading, and things were going quite well throughout this period. But there was a fall. And let me show you a little bit what it kind of looks on Google Maps, so you get some sense of it. This is in the Mediterranean right here, and here's Egypt down at the bottom. Here's modern day Turkey. This little arrow is where the Hittite culture was, Hattusa was. Over here is Greece. Down here would have been Sparta, so yes, this is Sparta, and up here Athens. The Mycenaean, and here's Crete down here. Now, in the Bronze Age, this was really a big trading circle. Cyprus is right here. That was a place where they got a lot of copper from. And if you go in, here is Crete right here, this island. And normally you wouldn't expect an island to be a great source of a culture, but it was, because it was centrally located, and they could make purple dyes and other things. The Mycenaeans were right up here, and Athens, where we're going to go to, is up here, still in the same location. Troy would have been over here, right at the mouth of this connection between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And the Hittites are over here. Kadesh, many people would know the Levant or the Holy Land right here. Here's Lebanon and Israel. Kadesh was right up here. And Syria was a location where they had a lot of ruins and other things. And Egypt down here. And this was a big trading circle throughout that entire time. And it was an area of a number of thriving civilizations. Again, we don't have much writing from them. We have little bits of writing from each one of them, but they were thriving, trading. And I will mention one of my favorite little areas right here is the Cyclades. They don't have any writing. We know next to nothing about them, but they had these neat little figurines that they used to make and put upon their graves, as far as we could tell. But they were throughout here. And by the way, I should mention, if you ever get a chance to go to the Getty Villa down in Malibu, you'll get a sense of what the Cyclades Islands had produced, these small little figurines and other things. Again, the Getty Villa is amazing to have in Southern California. And let me show you, let me show you a little bit about the, this is the Mycenae, a little bit of their ruins. This was Mycenae, the giant palace that they had. They call it the Palatial period. And these were the gates. These are famous, these lion gates right here. And Schliemann, the guy who discovered this, this was some of the gold he discovered, and he thought he was looking at the face of Agamemnon. He wasn't, but hey, you got to dream big. That was Mycenae. That was on the mainland. This was Crete. Crete was found by Sir Arthur Evans. This is the main one. This is a site. It was quite extensive. And the frescoes and things that they had were just stunning. This is a restored one that's on the wall of a bull, a guy jumping over a bull. And we believe they did this, that they did the bull jumping. And if you want to see it, there's you can go to YouTube, and they actually have some of it today. Obviously, it's not the ancient Minoans, but you can see people doing it today. So I definitely think they did it. They didn't have very good YouTube back then, so no matter. But here's one of this recreation of the throne room that the king would have been in. And here's a little bit of Hattusa. And this, I believe this was down in Syria, one of the lions that they had. And they had the lion gates that they had at Mycenae. So it seems to have been a common theme to have lions at the gate at the beginning of your palace. And here's a little bit of the writing. This is a little cuneiform from the Hattusa. I always call them the Hittites, but the city was Hattusa. Here is a little bit of Linear B. This was the writing that was in Crete and in in Mycenae. Here's a little portrait of Ramses II when he was going to battle for Kadesh, which was a famous battle between the Hittites and the Egyptians. Again, these people traded with each other, but they fought with each other. It was the most well represented classical battle, even better than any of the battles that the Greeks had. There was plenty of writing about it, so it was quite something. Really, the Egyptians got waxed at that one, but in the end, the Hittites made a big error, and the Egyptians probably came away with a win. But boy, they weren't happy about it. Ramses II went back to Egypt and had everybody write about how great he was. So even back in 1200 BC, he was producing fake news, so that wasn't anything new. But anyway, the whole thing comes crumbling down around 1200. All of it collapses. The Egyptians survive, but the Hittites went under, the Mycenaeans went under, the Minoans went under. Everything collapsed around 1200. They think there's multiple causes. There's signs that there were earthquake storms, in other words, rapid succession in earthquakes, one year, another one like 4 years later. And these were massive earthquakes. But there was also a drought going on, a massive drought throughout the region for a number of decades. And then there was representations of people called the Sea Peoples. They don't know really where they're from. Some people suggest that they're from Sardinia near Italy. But all this happened, and one of the things you always saw over and over again, cities falling but coming back and being built. I think Troy was rebuilt 6 times. And, the account that we have in Homer, is probably loosely based on a number of stories out of Troy. But Troy was rebuilt 6 times, but it wasn't rebuilt after this. None of these major cities were rebuilt. Only Egypt made it through the collapse in 1200. Again, hardly anybody knows about this today. I mean, obviously historians do, but most students don't know much about that. And that was the Bronze Age. So again, a collection of great civilizations that traded and fought with each other. And then it goes, and not much writing from it, not much at all. Then you have this, what I'm calling the Archaic period, from around 1200 to 700. And in that time period, there's no writing. Really, everything that had existed before collapsed. And they did not know what had existed before. They really had no record of it. And all they were doing was stomping around in their huts, and they knew ruins were around. They could see them around there. They could walk through them. And they thought these must have been great people. And they must have angered the gods. And they must have had a great collapse and everything. And they came up with stories and stories. And, things get handed down, like George Washington and his cherry tree and all this other silliness. Things just got handed down and developed into a kind of religion and mythology and history. And that's when Homer existed. And you've heard of Homer with the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I really hope you did not see that movie Troy, because sometimes things you've seen cannot be unseen. God, that was an awful thing. But anyway, Homer was probably illiterate. Homer as a person may not have existed. Instead, he may have just been a figure that they made up to account for this amalgamation of all these stories being put together into the Odyssey and into the Iliad. I don't think he actually existed, but hey, there's a lot of disagreement over that. Hesiod definitely existed, and he wrote works in days, and he also wrote a Theogony, where we know the origin of most of the gods that you know about comes actually from Hesiod's Theogony. Solon also probably was around this time. And he's kind of legendary, mythological, historical. One of the first lawgivers within Greece. And so they all looked back to him, set down the first codes of law. But that was this time period where they really got the stories solidified. The time period everybody knows about is the classical period, the last one. That's Athens, Sparta, the Persians, lots and lots and lots of writing. Homer had by now been written down. Beforehand, during the Archaic period, Homer wasn't written down. It was memorized and recited from memory. It was memorized and recited from memory, not read from a book. So that whole 800-page poem, hadn't been written down before it was performed. In the classical time period, it was written down. People could read it. Plato existed in this time. It's very important to get some perspective on Plato. In today's book form, the collected works of Plato, written in very small type, is over 1,500 pages. The same thing with Aristotle. This was an absolute flourishing of an intellectual culture that is hardly, I really don't think it's been seen before. You don't see it until much later on with the Chinese and European cultures coming to the fore. Really, the Arabic culture was, amazing. But really, this is something unique in the classical world, in the ancient world, what happened in Athens. And it was really in Athens. Sparta was a military state and a slave state. They did not write much. We really don't have any writing at all, I don't think, from them. All we know about them comes from the Athenians. There were other cities, Corinth, Thebes, and all these other cities, but they really were not like Athens. But Athens was about the size of the high desert. But boy, oh boy, did it put on quite a show. So lots of writing, lots of fighting. Pericles was this time. Socrates taught Plato. Plato taught Aristotle. Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. Sophocles would have existed around the time of Socrates and Plato. Okay, and he's the playwright. Apparently, he lived to about 90 years or something like that. So he lived long and he was quite popular. He's kind of like the Steven Spielberg of his day. His most famous play is Oedipus the Tyrant, sometimes called Oedipus Rex, very well known. And that was a myth handed down. Where it originated, they suspect that it came from Crete, but they don't really know. But maybe, they don't know. But the story was handed down, and it was circulating, and just Sophocles rewrote it in such a way that was his. So everybody in ancient Greece, ancient Athens in particular, would have known the story already. So, when you see Spielberg's Lincoln, you already know what's going to happen. Lincoln's going to go through the war and he's going to get shot. Spielberg can't change that. And everybody knows what's going to happen with Oedipus Rex. He's going to do some bad things to his family and end up sleeping with his mother, killing his father without knowing it. Really, really bad day. Sounds like a episode of Jerry Springer, but no, it was ancient Greek tragedy. And so he wrote that one, and he wrote dozens of plays. Again, lived for a long time. And he won a lot of, they had contests, and he apparently won a lot of them. Apparently he entered 30 years and maybe won 24. And I should warn you, if you look to places like Wikipedia, a lot of this stuff we just don't know for sure. Wikipedia acts like, and a lot of historical sources act like we know it. Maybe. There's always a question of how do you know what you know? And it's a particularly difficult question in classical history. How do we know what we know? And we're not really that sure about a lot of things with Sophocles, but we have other people writing about him, consistency within his plays. It seems pretty darn real that, yeah, he existed. And were his plays the way he wrote them? Almost certainly, yeah. They probably weren't messed with very much because of the metrical forms built into it. It's very hard to mess with poetry. It's very easy to mess with prose sources. So in his time, they performed those plays in very large theaters that were built kind of, like horseshoes. And again, I should mention that if you ever get a chance to go to the Getty Villa, they have one today, much smaller. They were very extensive back in his day. And the sound quality was magnificent. Absolutely, you could stand on the stage and talk, and somebody could hear you up at the top of the stadium. It was just, what they knew about acoustics was alarming. And again, it was just from around 500 to 400 was the flourishing time when they had wars, but they also produced just magnificent works of art, philosophy, and other things. So, but anyway, let's move on. So Antigone is the third play in the Theban plays. It was the first one to be written, and it's really the last one in the sequence, but it was the first one that Sophocles written. And if you know Sophocles, I'm assuming most of you don't, you can see that the quality in Antigone is a little bit rougher. Even though it's the last in the sequence of the Theban plays, it was the first one he wrote. And it's a little bit rougher, but boy, this play is one hell of a kick in the teeth. Antigone is an extremely strong character. I know most people go into it thinking women didn't act like that back then. Boy, howdy does Antigone act like that. She is quite the character, and very impressive. And the play is an amazing work of art. So it's the first one he wrote, and it goes into a core tension that the Greeks frequently dealt with. Homer deals with it, especially in the Odyssey, and the return with Odysseus from the Trojan War back to Ithaca. There's a whole tension with this man balancing his allegiances to the war and to other men, and how is his own family going to treat him when he gets back? And their loyalty to him allows him to reestablish his position within Ithaca. And it gets into this whole tension between loyalty to the family and loyalty to the state. And that's what Sophocles brings up with Antigone on page 1. That's what it is. And so Sophocles is going to play it somewhat differently, and you get to really get into how you interpret it. But that's the core tension in the middle of Antigone. Tension between loyalty to the family and loyalty to the state. Okay? So let me give you this one little thing. And I've asked you to do 3 metaphors in the first discussion. And let me show you a little bit about metaphors, okay? And I'll show you this with one. I'll demonstrate with one. I'm going to give you what I call the metaphor machine. The metaphor machine. Metaphors, and you've probably heard the definition that metaphors are comparisons between 2 dissimilar things without using like or as, or whatever, something like that. I hate that definition. It's perfectly accurate, but I don't like it because students have a hard time using it. I'm going to use one that's not quite as accurate, but a little more useful. I'm going to say metaphors are using the words of one thing to describe another. Now, that's a sloppy definition, but it works for me, and it works for most students if you're not going to be an English major. In other words, that's basically the same thing as personification or simile. In my mind, you're not really doing anything different if you use like or as, or if you use, reference to a person in there. So I'm going to call personification, simile, and metaphor all one big metaphoric family. So using the words of one thing to describe another. Okay? And metaphors aren't something that are used just in literature. They're used constantly in the English language, in political speech, we use it in our daily languages talking to each other. All kinds of occasions. I was just listening to a speech from Mattis today talking about our defense readiness at the Pentagon, and he's using metaphors all over the place to explain certain things he wants the audience to understand. So we use them all the time because we want our audience to see a certain situation in a certain way. Okay? And so what I'm going to give you now is what I call the metaphor machine. 3 stages, and I want you to use this at the discussion board. Okay, and whenever you see something that looks like metaphoric language, that using the words of one thing to describe another, stop and go, okay, what is this person literally talking about? What are he or she literally talking about or writing about? What's behind the curtain? Okay, and then go, okay, what type of words is he or she using? What are they using to describe this over here? And there's going to be a disconnect, and that's very important that there's a disconnect between what is being described and the words being used to describe it. And that's built into every type of metaphoric language. It's built into similes, it's built into personification, it's built into metaphors. They all do that. There's a disconnect between what they're actually talking about and the types of words they're using, because they want to persuade you and take a certain perspective on this situation. Okay? And the 3rd stage of the metaphor machine is you ask, why these words for this situation? Why are they doing this? Okay? What are they trying to do here? Why is this important? Now notice that 1 and 2 are pretty much straightforward. Identify this and identify that, and everybody's going to agree on it. Step 3, I'm going to be allowing you to take things in a slightly different direction. You are going to figure it out and tell me why you think it's happening. Okay? So let me show you this. Let me open up a copy of Antigone, and let me also, because you've stuck with this video this long, you can go ahead if you need to get a copy of Antigone outside my office. I put 20 of them out there, and if you want to pick one up, go ahead and pick one up. You can save a little bit on your printing and not upset people at your work or your parents because you ran out of paper and ink. So you can get one outside my office. I've got 20 of them out there, so that's a door prize for the first 20 who get there. But anyway, let me go through Sophocles here. This is the cast of characters. And that's a neat old painting of them. You can see this is Antigone right there, and that's Ismene. That should be clear before the end of the first page. And now they're out in front of the palace. Now, all this language you see early on, Ismene, dear sister, you would think that we had already suffered enough for the curse on Oedipus. All of this is straightforward language. And Ismene said, as I've heard nothing, I know that 2 sisters lost 2 brothers, and this is all straightforward. Now, mind you, they're both being pretty sketchy. I have heard nothing. Nah, Ismene's heard something. She knows something's going on with Creon. Okay. And then you get Antigone being a little bit sketchy too. I thought so, and that is why I wanted you to come here with me. There is something we must do. And Ismene says, why do you speak so strangely? Because Antigone's making stuff up. Listen, Ismene, Creon buried our brother Eteocles with military honors, gave him a soldier's funeral, and that was right, that he should. All of that is straightforward, no metaphors. Okay? Next. But Polynices, they fought as bravely and died as miserably. They say that Creon has sworn no one shall bury him, no one mourn for him. And that's all. I mean, that's goofy because Polynices was a traitor to the city, and Antigone's leaving that out. It's still there, but she's leaving it out. So Antigone's manipulating the situation because this is her brother first and a traitor to the city dead last. Okay, so you see that going on, that theme of loyalty to the city and loyalty to the family. She is totally loyal to the family to the point of being blind about the city. But mind you, still no metaphors. Sketchy stuff there, but still no metaphors. Okay? And then watch this. Okay? They say that Creon has sworn no one shall bury him, no one mourn for him. Well, of course somebody's going to mourn for him because he's got family, no matter what. And then she does this. But the body must lie in the field, a sweet treasure for carrion birds to find as they search for food. Bing, bing, bing. That's a metaphor. Okay? Bodies are not sweet treasure. What has she done here? She's literally, this is step 1 of the metaphor machine. She's talking about the body of Polynices being pulled apart by vultures and other carrion birds. That's what she's actually talking about. But then she uses this metaphor, a sweet treasure for carrion birds. Sweet treasure, that's weird. That's using the language as if somebody's been giving an unearned reward. This is something they just came upon, and it's a glorious thing. Using that kind of language with the exposed body of her brother, that's a disconnect, and that's a metaphor. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why is she doing this? Because and I'm going to answer my way, but you could answer it differently. Okay? So first of all, notice, stage 1, it's a body out in the dust, and it's getting torn apart from birds. Number 2, it's being described as sweet treasure, as if it's an unearned reward that you just came upon by luck. Okay? That's what it's being described as. Why do this? Because she wants to have Ismene see that those who feed on the dead are being rewarded in Creon's Thebes. The ones who feed on the dead are being rewarded now. This is what Creon's Thebes is all about. That's what she wants Ismene to see. Okay? That's my analysis. You can do it differently. It's up to you to analyze it however you see fit. But I want you to do that with 3 metaphors in this first section, up to, I think it's about line 493 or so I gave you. Go through, and by the way, there's about 3 metaphors per page in this, okay? And you're going to be tripping over them. You just got to find them, break them down, do your best. Don't worry if at the discussion board you don't quite do it right. Try it out, do your best, and get 3 of them and just run the metaphor machine. Do stage 1, say what's going on. Stage 2, what kind of words are being used. And then stage 3, you come up with your own interpretation of why that metaphor. Okay? So give that a go. Go at that discussion area and keep at this, and I'll be looking forward to seeing your first discussion post. Okay? Take care, folks.